ראש הממשלה בנימין נתניהו טען כי התובעים אינם מחפשים צדק אלא להדיחו מתפקידו. Let's learn how to understand the news in Hebrew. If your Hebrew is already at a relatively advanced level, but you still find it very hard to understand the news, today you're going to understand why. In this video, we're going to do two things. A, learn how to crack and understand news-style Hebrew. B, understand why the news is so hard to follow even if your Hebrew level is quite advanced. So how are we going to do that? I'm going to take a real quote from an Israeli newspaper, translate it into English, and show you how the same ideas within that sentence would be expressed in everyday Israeli Hebrew. You see, the Hebrew used in newspapers and in radio and TV news is formal, standard, and elevated Hebrew. And in Hebrew, there is a huge difference between formal, news style, standard language and everyday spoken Hebrew, Israeli Hebrew. So huge that it can feel like two completely different languages. The differences are, of course, in vocabulary, which is elevated in News Hebrew, but it goes far beyond that. The grammar rules are different. The sentence structure is different. Even the pronunciation is different. So it's really no surprise that understanding the news feels so difficult. In the quote I'll bring, we'll dissect the sentence word by word so you can understand exactly where the difficulty comes from. And this will also be the key to understanding news-style Hebrew and a step forward in your ability to follow the news in Israel. Hi, I'm Noya from UlpaNoya, your language coach for Israeli Hebrew and the Israeli accent. But today we're going to focus a little less on Israeli Hebrew and more on what I like to call Hebrew with a tie. Let's begin. ראש הממשלה בנימין נתניהו טען כי התובעים אינם מחפשים צדק אלא להדיחו מתפקידו. Let's see how this might sound in Israeli Hebrew. ביבי, ראש ממשלה, אמר שהתובעים לא מחפשים צדק אלא להדיח אותו מהתפקיד. Does that make a bit more sense now? Let's break down what's going on here. First, the translation. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu argued that the prosecutors are not seeking justice, but rather aiming to remove him from office. The sentence starts with Rosh HaMemshala, the Prime Minister, literally the head of the government. Rosh HaMemshala, the government. This kind of structure is called the construct state, or in Hebrew, smichut. What is a construct state, smichut? In Hebrew, when we want to say x of y or y's x, we often don't use the word of, shel. Instead, we use smichut. In a smichut phrase, two nouns are linked together. The first noun is the thing we're talking about, the x. The second noun is the owner or definer, the y. So it's literally like xy, meaning x of y. For example, if we want to talk about a table that is used for work, we don't say a table of work, shulchan shel avoda. We say a work table, shulchan avoda. So the two nouns are connected directly without using of. Now, when the smichut phrase becomes definite, something interesting happens when it comes to the difference between standard Hebrew and Israeli Hebrew. In both cases, to make the phrase definite, we add the Hebrew, ha, to one of the nouns in the phrase. But here's the catch. In standard Hebrew, the ha always attaches to the second noun in the smichut phrase. In everyday Israeli Hebrew, however, it often appears on the first noun instead. Often, not always. ראש הממשלה בנימין נתניהו, ביבי, ראש ממשלה. Next we have Binyamin Netanyahu in News Hebrew versus Bibi in Israeli. It's simply more common for Israelis to call him Bibi in everyday conversation. The next word in the quote is ta'an, argued. In everyday Hebrew, people may use this word as well, but in terms of the vocabulary you've probably acquired so far, chances are you're much more familiar with the word amar, said, while ta'an, argued, might be new to you. In this case, there's no shortcut. The solution here is simply expanding your vocabulary. Now, how do we say argued that in Hebrew? Ta'an ki, but in Israeli we hear amar she. Interesting. In the news we hear ki, and in Israeli we hear she. So at first glance, Israeli Hebrew's amar she makes sense, because a lot of you probably know that she means that. He argued or he said that. Hu amar she. But the news Hebrew seems to mean he argued because. Ta'an ki. He argued because? So no. As strange as it may sound, while in everyday Hebrew she means that and ki means because, in New Style Hebrew, the word ki is also used to mean that. For example, he believed that, hu ha'emin ki, he said that, hu amar ki, he argued that, hu ta'an ki. So if you're reading or listening to the news in Hebrew and you come across the word ki, and because doesn't make sense in the sentence, know that in this context, it actually means that. Alright, so what do we have so far? ראש הממשלה בנימין נתניהו טען כי the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu argued that התובעים, the prosecutors, אינם מחפשים צדק, are not seeking justice. Let's pause on enam. What does enam mean? Let's check how it sounds in Israeli Hebrew. לא מחפשים צדק. In New Style Hebrew, we hear enam. In Israeli Hebrew, we hear lo. Same meaning, different register. In everyday Israeli Hebrew, to say no, not, isn't, aren't, we simply use the word lo. התובעים לא מחפשים צדק. The prosecutors are not seeking justice. In New Style Hebrew, something different happens. Instead of using only lo for not, isn't, aren't, News Hebrew often uses the word en. You probably know en as meaning there isn't or there are no. But in News Hebrew, en is also used simply to mean not. And here's where it gets even trickier. It can be conjugated to agree with the subject of the sentence. So in our sentence, התובעים אינם מחפשים צדק, the prosecutors are not seeking justice, the word en is conjugated for third person plural, they, him, because it refers to the prosecutors. En plus him, אינם, they're not. If the subject were third person feminine singular, she, he, the form would be אינה. He אינה מחפשת צדק. She is not seeking justice. And if the subject were third person masculine singular, he, who, the form would be אינו. הוא אינו מחפש צדק. He is not seeking justice. So this is already a major difference between Israeli Hebrew and New Style Hebrew. But now that you know that en can also mean not in New Style Hebrew and that it changes form, the next time you come across it, it won't throw you off anymore. Moving on. After our not seeking justice, we have but rather aiming to remove him from office. In New Style Hebrew, this sounds like אלא להדיחו מתפקידו. In everyday Israeli, it sounds like אלא להדיח אותו מהתפקיד. Already in the very first word, you can hear a difference in pronunciation. The news anchor uses the standard pronunciation of the word, but rather, ela, with a stress on the last syllable. The native Israeli speaker uses the same word, but with a stress on the first syllable, ela. This is a pronunciation difference between formal New Style Hebrew and everyday Israeli. And finally, we have to remove him from office. In New Style Hebrew, להדיחו מתפקידו. In everyday Israeli, להדיח אותו מהתפקיד. Here, we can see the unique way formal or New Style Hebrew compresses information into fewer words in a way you rarely hear in everyday spoken Israeli. First, we have the verb, להדיח, which means to remove from office, and the object, אותו, meaning him, right? Remove him, להדיח אותו. But notice what New Style Hebrew does. Instead of using two words, להדיח אותו, it combines them into one word, להדיחו. The him is hidden inside the verb as a suffix, o. להדיח, להדיחו. And this can be done with any pronoun. If it were to remove her, it would be להדיחה. If it were to remove them, it would be להדיחם, and so on. Something similar happens with a noun. The word tafkid means role, position, or job, and in this context, office. In New Style Hebrew, we again see the noun merging with a pronoun. The o added to tafkid refers to he, or more precisely here, his. So instead of saying his position in two words, התפקיד שלו, formal Hebrew compresses it into one word, תפקידו. In everyday Israeli Hebrew, we would say התפקיד שלו, his position, or even just התפקיד without his, because in Israeli Hebrew, when it's clear who owns the noun, we often omit the possessive altogether. That's it, we did it. I hope your brain isn't exploding right now and that this helped you understand a bit more how News Hebrew works. That's a lot to process for one video, and I think this is enough for today. But if you'd like me to make another video breaking down New Style Hebrew, let me know in the comments. If this video helped you, give it a like and subscribe for more deep dives into real Hebrew. See you in the next video.